The supreme leader is dead, and right now every news anchor on the planet is telling you the same story. Israeli strikes, retaliation, chaos. But that's not the real story. Khamenei's death wasn't an accident of war. It was the final stage of a power transition that was engineered years ago. While you were watching missiles light up the night sky over Tehran, while diplomats issued their carefully worded condemnations, something else was happening. Something deliberate. Something planned. Because the men who will control what comes next, they've been positioning themselves for this moment since before most people knew there was a game being played. The Revolutionary Guard generals who've been quietly consolidating economic empires, the shadow networks moving billions through Dubai and Baghdad, the foreign intelligence services who've spent decades cultivating assets inside Iran's fractured elite. They weren't reacting to Khamenei's death. They were waiting for it. The strikes you saw on television, those were just the trigger, the visible part, the part they wanted you to focus on. The invisible hand reshaping the Middle East moved long before those bombs ever fell. This is the story no one is telling you. Iran isn't just another Middle Eastern country teetering on the edge, it's the keystone of an entire region, and when it shifts, everything shifts with it. Consider what's actually at stake here. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow waterway Iran's southern coast controls, sees 20% of the world's oil pass through it every single day. 20%. That's not influence, that's a chokehold on the global economy. But Iran's power extends far beyond its borders. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, militias embedded throughout Iraq. These aren't just allies, they're extensions of Tehran's strategic reach, a shadow empire built over 4 decades. And beneath Iranian soil sits the 4th largest proven oil reserve on Earth, alongside the 2nd largest natural gas deposits. We're talking about enough hydrocarbons to fuel nations for generations. So when we talk about Iran's transformation, we're not discussing one country's political future. We're discussing who will control the energy arteries of the 21st century, who will inherit a network of proxy forces, and who will shape the balance of power from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. Every time Iran falls, it falls the same way. Think about that for a moment. 1953, a democratically elected leader threatens Western oil interests. Within months, protests flood the streets, the military fractures, and a new regime takes power. 1979, the Shah becomes inconvenient. Suddenly, demonstrations paralyze the nation, security forces melt away, and a new order emerges from the chaos. Now watch today's headlines: the protests, the economic strangulation, the fracturing loyalties within the Revolutionary Guard. You're not watching history repeat itself, you're watching a pattern. And patterns don't happen by accident. There's a difference between a building that collapses and a building that's demolished. One is chaos, the other is architecture. One falls unpredictably, the other falls exactly where someone wants it to fall. So here's the question no one in mainstream coverage is asking. Is Iran experiencing a revolution, or is it experiencing a controlled demolition? And if it's the latter, who's holding the detonator? Because the answer to that question determines not just Iran's future, but the future of everyone caught in its blast radius. The regime won't collapse because of protests, it won't fall from sanctions alone, and it certainly won't crumble because the West wishes it so. Regime change requires architecture, decades of it. You need media networks broadcasting alternative narratives. You need diaspora organizations with funding pipelines. You need religious scholars willing to reinterpret theology. You need military officers who've been cultivated, business elites who've been promised protection, tribal leaders who've been given guarantees. This isn't conspiracy, this is statecraft. Every successful transition in modern history followed the same blueprint. The Shah didn't fall in 1979 because students got angry. He fell because the infrastructure for his replacement had been quietly constructed for years. Khamenei didn't emerge from nothing. He was positioned. Now ask yourself, who is being positioned today? Because somewhere, right now, there are think tanks drafting constitutions for a country that hasn't changed yet. There are exile councils rehearsing governance. There are intelligence services mapping every fault line in Iranian society. The question was never if Iran transforms. The question is, whose blueprint gets implemented when it does? Tehran, 1953. A man named Mohammad Mossadegh stands before the Iranian parliament and signs his own death warrant. His crime? demanding that Iranian oil belong to Iranians. For decades, the British had extracted billions while paying Tehran pennies. Mossadegh said no more. He nationalized the Anglo-Iranian oil company overnight. London panicked. Washington listened. What happened next would poison the Middle East for generations. The CIA called it Operation Ajax. British intelligence called it Operation Boot. Together, they called it regime change. American and British agents flooded Tehran with cash. They bribed newspaper editors, paid street gangs, and manufactured chaos from nothing. Fake communist mobs rioted on cue. The economy strangled under sanctions. Within months, Mossadegh, democratically elected, internationally respected, was gone, arrested in his pajamas, tried in a military court. And the Shah? Mohammad Reza Pahlavi returned on a throne rebuilt by foreign hands. He would rule for 26 years with secret police, torture chambers, and unlimited Western backing. The Iranian people never forgot who put him there, and that memory would soon ignite a revolution that changed everything. The Shah sat on the peacock throne, but everyone knew who put him there, and Mohammad Reza Pahlavi never forgot it. Washington had handed him a kingdom. In return, he gave them everything they wanted: oil contracts, military bases, a reliable vote against the Soviets. Iran became America's unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Middle East. But absolute power does something to a man. The Shah built SAVAK, a secret police force trained by the CIA itself. Dissidents disappeared into Evin prison. Some never came out. Those who did carried scars that told stories no one dared repeat. Meanwhile, American weapons poured across the border. F-14 Tomcats, Cobra helicopters, the most advanced arsenal in the region, all pointed at Soviet shadows. The Shah modernized Iran at gunpoint. Women unveiled, villages electrified, ancient traditions bulldozed in the name of progress. He called it the White Revolution. His people had another name for it. 26 years of suppressed rage, humiliation, and whispered prayers in underground mosques. The pressure built behind a dam of American-funded repression, and in 1979, that dam finally shattered. The Americans never saw him coming. While the CIA watched the communists, while they monitored the leftists and the labor unions, an elderly cleric in exile was recording cassette tapes, thousands of them, smuggled into Iran inside vegetable crates, hidden beneath prayer rugs, passed hand to hand through the bazaars. Ayatollah Khamenei understood something the intelligence agencies didn't. You don't need guns to start a revolution. You need grievance. And 25 years of the Shah had manufactured grievance on an industrial scale. When the streets of Tehran erupted in 1979, Washington scrambled for contingencies. They found none. Their entire Iran strategy had one assumption baked into its foundation: the Shah would last forever. He didn't. In February, the Peacock throne collapsed. The man America had installed, armed and protected, fled to Egypt with suitcases of cash. And the nation that was supposed to be the West's permanent ally in the Middle East became its permanent adversary. The operation that began in 1953 had finally delivered its true product. Not stability, not democracy, not oil security. Blowback, the most powerful kind and the kind that outlives everyone who caused it. For 40 years, Washington tried everything. Sanctions that strangled the economy, support for opposition movements, diplomatic isolation. Nothing worked. The Islamic Republic absorbed every blow and survived. Revolutionary ideology proved more resilient than anyone predicted. The harder America pushed, the tighter the regime gripped power. But somewhere in the early 2000s, the strategy shifted. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, the new approach wasn't about toppling Tehran from the outside. It was about letting Tehran destroy itself from within. Think about it. Every sanction doesn't just hurt the government. It erodes the social contract between rulers and citizens. Every economic crisis forces the regime to choose between military spending and public welfare. Every crackdown on protest creates new dissidents. This is the long game, patient, methodical, invisible. You don't need to invade a country to collapse it. You just need to accelerate the contradictions already tearing it apart. Demographic decline, brain drain, currency collapse, generational resentment. The question isn't whether Iran's system will fracture. The question is who's positioning themselves to control what emerges from the wreckage. The killing started years before the final strikes landed. January 2020. A US drone turns Qasem Soleimani into a fireball on a Baghdad airport road. Iran's most powerful military mind, the architect of proxy warfare across 4 countries, eliminated in seconds. Tehran promised revenge. They launched missiles at Iraqi bases housing American troops. The world held its breath. Then, nothing. But the hits kept coming. November 20. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, father of Iran's nuclear program, ambushed outside Tehran by a remote-controlled machine gun. No assassins to capture. No trail to follow. Natanz nuclear facility. Mysterious explosions. Centrifuges destroyed. Power systems crippled. Each attack carried the same signature: precise intelligence, 0 fingerprints, and a message. We can reach anyone, anywhere, anytime. These weren't random acts of sabotage. They were stress tests. Someone was mapping Iran's command structure, identifying vulnerabilities, measuring response times. And they discovered something critical. The Islamic Republic's legendary security apparatus had blind spots. Big ones. The system that had survived 8 years of war with Iraq and 4 decades of sanctions had developed cracks. Those cracks would soon become chasms. Khamenei wasn't just Iran's supreme leader, he was the system. For 35 years, this one man held together forces that should have torn each other apart. The Revolutionary Guards, with their billions in business empires and their fingers on the missile triggers. The clerical establishment in Qom, guarding their theological authority like jealous priests. The elected politicians in Tehran, performing democracy while real power watched from above. Khamenei balanced them all. A word here, a promotion there, a quiet threat when necessary. But here's what nobody planned for. There is no second Khamenei. The Islamic Republic's constitution demands the supreme leader possess religious credentials that today's candidates simply don't have. The most powerful men in Iran are generals and bureaucrats, not grand ayatollahs. So when Khamenei goes, and at 85 with reported health problems, that day approaches, Iran doesn't face a power vacuum. It faces a succession bomb that's been ticking since 989. The question isn't whether this bomb explodes. It's who's positioned to pick up the pieces when it does. And the answer to that question will reshape the entire Middle East. The supreme leader's grip weakens, and the vultures circle. Inside Tehran, 3 factions wage shadow war for Iran's future. The IRGC hardliners, men who built empires on sanctions and smuggling, push for escalation. Total confrontation with the West. They'd rather rule ashes than share power. Behind them stands Russia, hungry for a loyal proxy to bleed American resources indefinitely. Then come the pragmatic clerics, survivors who've read history. They watched the Soviet collapse. They know regimes die when they stop adapting. These men negotiate secretly through Omani back channels, seeking any deal that keeps them alive. China backs this faction, protecting $40 billion in infrastructure investments. The reformists smell opportunity in chaos. Younger technocrats who believe controlled liberalization might yet save the system. Europe whispers encouragement, dreaming of a moderate Iran they can rehabilitate. And in Los Angeles, Paris, and London, the exiled opposition watches. The monarchists, the socialists, the ethnic separatists, each claims legitimacy, each has intelligence services funding their broadcasts, their networks, their plans. Iran isn't dying into a vacuum, it's dying into a feeding frenzy. The Pentagon learned its lesson in Baghdad. Nation building doesn't work. Democracy at gunpoint, a $1 trillion fantasy that created ISIS and empowered the very regime they tried to contain. So the playbook changed. You don't need to rebuild a country if you never let it stabilize in the first place. The new doctrine has a name in policy circles: managed fragmentation. Keep the target state weak enough that it can't threaten regional interests, but not so collapsed that refugees flood allied borders. Iran divided into competing ethnic territories isn't a nightmare scenario for Washington. It's this scenario. Kurdish regions pulling toward independence, Azeri populations looking north to Baku, Arab minorities in Khuzestan eyeing separation, a fractured Iran can't fund Hezbollah, can't arm the Houthis, can't threaten Saudi oil fields or Israeli security. The goal isn't regime change anymore, it's regime erosion. Slow, grinding, permanent instability that keeps Tehran focused inward, fighting fires at home instead of projecting power abroad. And the sanctions, they're not punishment, they're the pressure cooker, designed to accelerate exactly what's already breaking. Every capital in the Middle East is running calculations right now, and they all lead to the same conclusion. Iran's weakness is their opportunity. Tel Aviv sees this clearest. A fractured Iran doesn't just remove a nuclear threat, it severs the lifeline to Hezbollah, to Hamas, to every proxy that has kept Israeli generals awake for decades. The head of the octopus dies, the tentacles wither. Riyadh smells something different in the wind: restoration. For 40 years, the Saudis watched Shia influence creep across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. A collapsed Iran means the Sunni world reclaims what it lost. The old order returns, and then there's Ankara. Erdogan watches the chaos with different eyes entirely. A destabilized Iran means Kurdish groups lose their ability to play powers against each other. It means Turkish influence flowing into Azerbaijan, into Turkic populations Tehran has suppressed for a century. Some whisper he dreams in Ottoman. 3 nations, 3 visions, none of them involve a strong unified Iran. The chess pieces have been moving for years. Most people just weren't watching the board. But while Washington plays the long game, another power has been quietly rewriting the rules. China. Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative doesn't just pass near Iran, it runs directly through it. Ports, railways, telecommunications infrastructure. Chinese money has penetrated sectors. American subsequent sanctions were designed to strangle. In 2021, China and Iran signed a 25-year strategic partnership. The details remain deliberately vague, but intelligence estimates suggest $400 billion in Chinese investment. Energy, transportation, banking systems that bypass the dollar entirely. And here's what American strategists underestimated. Beijing doesn't want what Washington wants. They're not interested in democratic transformation. They don't care about human rights leverage or regime change. China wants one thing from Iran: stability, stable oil flows, stable trade routes, a stable partner that owes them everything. So when the Islamic Republic begins its final fracture, and it will fracture, the managed chaos playbook faces competition. China isn't trying to guide the collapse, they're trying to prevent it entirely. The question becomes, whose vision for Iran wins? The missiles launch within hours. Hezbollah mobilizes. Proxies across Iraq activate sleeper cells. And watching from secure bunkers, the planners smile, because this is exactly what they wanted. Iran's retaliation isn't about revenge, it's about survival. The regime must respond or appear weak to its own population. But here's the trap. Every rocket that flies, every American base targeted, every Israeli civilian threatened, becomes justification. Justification for Phase 2. The strikes weren't designed to end the conflict, they were designed to start one. Each Iranian response gets catalogued, broadcast, amplified. Look at the aggression, look at the terrorism. We have no choice but to escalate. The regime is fighting for its life using the only playbook it knows, but that playbook was studied, analysed, and weaponized against them decades ago. They're not making decisions, they're following a script someone else wrote, playing a role someone else cast them in. And the tragedy? They know it. The Revolutionary Guard knows every missile validates the next bombing campaign. But they fire anyway, because the alternative is admitting they've already lost. The streets of Tehran told a different story in September 2022. Mahsa Amini died in morality police custody, and something cracked open. Millions poured into the streets, not just women removing hijabs, but men, students, workers, entire families screaming 3 words that terrified every power broker watching. Woman, life, freedom. 85 million Iranians live under this regime. They didn't choose the Revolutionary Guards, they didn't vote for nuclear brinkmanship, and they certainly didn't ask to become pawns in someone else's great game. This is the variable that breaks every model. Washington plans for regime change. Beijing calculates energy dependencies. Moscow counts on chaos. But none of them control what happens when a 22-year-old girl becomes a martyr, and her generation decides they've had enough. The protesters of 232 rejected the theocracy and foreign intervention. They wanted Iran, not an American client state, not a Chinese vassal, not a Russian proxy, just Iran. That movement was crushed. Hundreds killed, thousands imprisoned. But the demographic pressure hasn't disappeared. It's waiting. And every external power making plans for Iran's future knows this generation rewrites everything. The clock is already ticking on 3 possible futures. Scenario 1. The Revolutionary Guard seize total control. They've spent decades building parallel economies, commanding militias, controlling borders, a military junta wearing religious clothing. Russia and China would recognize it within hours. The oil keeps flowing east. Scenario 2, a negotiated transition. Western powers, Gulf states, and internal reformers engineer a managed collapse. Think Myanmar's failed experiment, but with nuclear facilities to secure. Washington has wargamed this since 2003. The pipelines get redirected toward Europe. Scenario 3, nobody wins. Provincial fractures accelerate. Baluchi separatists, Kurdish regions, Azeri nationalism, Arab minorities in Khuzestan where the oil actually sits. Syria's decade of bleeding would look contained by comparison. 85 million people, 40% under 30, a powder keg searching for a match. Here's what matters. None of these scenarios are theoretical. Intelligence agencies in Langley, Beijing, Tel Aviv, and Riyadh have already chosen their preferred outcome. Money has already moved, weapons have already been positioned. The only question isn't whether Iran transforms, it's whether anyone survives the transformation. The year was in 1953. In a quiet room in London, British and American intelligence officers drew up plans to remove Iran's democratically elected leader. Operation Ajax succeeded brilliantly for exactly 26 years. Then came Nusrat 9. The Shah they'd installed fled in disgrace, and the revolution that followed created the very theocracy now crumbling before our eyes. The architects of that coup spent decades managing the consequences of their success. Now, history whispers its warning again. Every empire that has tried to engineer Iran's future has discovered the same immutable truth. You can demolish a government, but you cannot control what rises from the rubble. The energy released in collapse follows its own logic, finds its own channels, creates its own monsters. The strategists in Washington, Beijing, and Tel Aviv each believe they can guide this transition, shape what emerges, install favourable outcomes. They study their predecessors' failures and convince themselves they've learned the lessons, but the lesson of Iran has never changed. Those who build traps for nations inevitably find themselves caught within them. The question isn't whether this pattern will repeat, it's who gets buried this time. The question was never really about Khamenei. It wasn't about nuclear centrifuges spinning in mountain bunkers or tankers sliding through the Strait of Hormuz. Those are symptoms, the disease runs deeper. What's actually being tested in Iran is whether empire still works, whether one nation, however powerful, can reach across oceans and continents to reshape another society and its image, whether sanctions and covert operations and diplomatic isolation can bend a civilization that's existed for 3,000 years. History suggests the answer is no. Not because the target survives intact, but because the attempt transforms the attacker. Every empire that tried to control Persia left changed. The Greeks, the Arabs, the Mongols, the British, now America. Iran isn't just a country facing slow death, it's a mirror, and what Washington sees reflected back, whether it admits it or not, is the limits of power itself. The harder you squeeze, the more slips through your fingers, the more you isolate, the more alternatives emerge. This is the final exam of the American century, and the results aren't graded on a curve. The strikes were just the trigger, but triggers don't aim themselves. Someone chose the targets, someone timed the chaos, someone positioned their pieces while the world watched smoke rise over Tehran. And now, as Iran burns from within, as factions claw at each other for whatever remains, the real game reveals itself. This was never about destroying a country, it was about inheriting one. Every protest, every defection, every economic collapse, these aren't random consequences. They're conditions, carefully cultivated, patiently waited for. The question was never if Iran would fracture. It was when, and more importantly, who would be standing closest when it did. But here's what keeps the architects awake at night. History has a habit of producing variables, movements that can't be bought, leaders that can't be predicted, populations that refuse the script they were handed. The inheritance was decided long before the first missile flew. The succession plan is already written, but plans require compliance, and 70 million Iranians weren't consulted. So the only question left, the one nobody can answer, did they account for what they can't control?